I'm standing about 2 miles to the east of the town of Ypres in Belgium, and I'm on a slight slope. Behind me there's a ridge that runs northeast to southwest as far as the eye can see. Actually, it's difficult to define the top of the edge, as it's covered with the hedges and trees that surround the fields covering this busy agricultural area. But in 1917, the only defining features looking around would be the ruins of Ypres in front of me, and the land I'm standing on was a scene of desolation. No trees, nor houses, just a few pulverised bricks being the only evidence of any village in the area. Here, there was just mud, shell holes, and the bloody detritus of war, and just out of sight, hidden behind the ridge, was a village, which when captured would mark the first stage in the big push, the campaign to oust the German forces from Flanders fields. And the name of that village came to signify the utter meaningless sacrifice of thousands upon thousands of lives. And the name of that village? Passchendaele. Hi, I'm Dave Scragg, and for an arts programme special, Linda and I have come out to the Belgian town of Ypres to discover the truth about the Battle of Passchendaele. Along the way, we'll be looking at how the clay kickers became the heroes of the Battle of Messines Ridge and the terrible effects of poison gas. We'll be taking some rest and relaxation in Popperinga and finding out why it wasn't so lucky being a black cat in Ypres. And we'll return to Ypres in the evening for a special ceremony of remembrance under the Menin Gate. For some time, Sir Douglas Haig, Commander-in-Chief of the British forces, had been planning a major offensive in Flanders. The plan was to strike out from Ypres, over the Passchendaele Ridge, and then on to push the Germans out of Flanders and take back the coastal ports. Haig predicted that this assault would be completed in just a few days, because he was convinced, wrongly as it worked out, that the German army was near breaking point. Now, the War Cabinet, led by Lloyd George, were becoming increasingly edgy by the mounting casualty list, but as there was no viable alternative, they agreed to Haig's plans. The Third Battle of Ypres and the battle for Passchendaele was about to begin. It's interesting to note just how many soldier poets are involved in the Ypres campaign. Many lost their lives, but some, like Edmund Blunden, survived. But for the rest of his life, his work would be influenced by his experiences of war. He was the longest serving First World War poet, and he spent 2 years in the front line, not just at Ypres, but also on the Somme. He won the Military Cross for his conspicuous gallantry in action when he and a runner completed a reconnaissance mission, an almost suicidal action under constant shelling. Now, when he was young, he'd been inspired by the countryside, but the experience of war gave him another voice. His war poems give an insight into the mind-shattering experience of war, and this insight goes beyond the horrors of frontline battle, but also to the beauty as well as the destruction of the landscape. Now, he also attempts to convey the emotional bond between soldiers and the long-term impact of the war on the survivor. Now, in later years, Edmund Blunden lived in Long Melford in Suffolk, and he died in 1974. Private Beanie, his runner at Ypres and Passchendaele, attended his funeral and placed a wreath of Flanders poppies on his grave. This is Edmund Blunden, Concert Party, Busseboom.
The stage was set, the house was packed. The famous troupe began. Our laughter thundered, act by act. Time light as sunbeams ran. Dance sprang and spun and neared and fled. Jest chirped at gayest pitch. Rhythm dazzled, action sped, most comically rich. With generals and lame privates both, such charms worked wonders, till the show was over. Lagging loath, we faced the sunset chill. And standing on the sandy way, with the cracked church peering past, we heard another matinee. We heard the maniac blast of barrage south by Saint Eloi, and the red lights flaming there called madness. Come, my bonny boy, and dance to the latest air. To this new concert white we stood. Cold certainty held our breath, while men in the tunnels below Larch Wood were kicking men to death.
Now the Third Battle of Ypres would fall into two parts. Before they pressed on to Passchendaele, the Allies first had to take the Messines Ridge. This was a stretch of high ground to the south of the Ypres salient. The Germans had occupied this land since 1915, and from it they were able to bombard the Allied supply lines and trench systems. It was also a key observational point for the whole area, but taking such a heavily defended ridge would be a daunting prospect. An all-out attack would be incredibly costly, so another approach was needed, and the solution was found deep underground. Now, the undermining of an enemy's defences wasn't new, and the Assyrians back in the 9th century were attacking the foundations of enemy fortresses. Mining was seen by the Allies as a way of destroying the Germans' virtually impregnable defences with their deep dugouts and trench systems. The idea was to dig tunnels under the enemy lines, pack underground chambers with a huge amount of high explosive, and then detonate it. In the utter chaos that followed, the infantry would attack what was left of the enemy force and take their positions. Now, Linda and I have seen the devastating force of these mines when we visited the huge Lochnagar crater on the Somme last year. I couldn't imagine anyone surviving such a blast. Specialist tunnelling companies were set up to dig the tunnels hundreds of yards long towards the enemy lines, and they would take months, if not years, to prepare. The Allies had an advantage over the Germans when it came to digging the tunnels, as the diggers, as they came to be known, used a technique known as clay kicking. Now, the clay kicker lay on his back and pushed a specially designed spade into the clay subsoil to cut and clear the clay. This was found to be a very efficient way of digging the tunnels because it was quicker, and more importantly, because it was silent, and this was an all-important factor. Any sound the tunnellers made could be picked up by the other side, so it was vital they did their work in complete silence. Throughout the tunnels, listening posts were set up using very advanced listening devices that would pick up the slightest vibration. Now, both sides, because the Germans were also tunnelling, would put out defensive tunnels in an attempt to intercept the enemy and disarm the explosive charges. If they were close enough to an enemy tunnel, a long tube full of high explosive known as a camouflet would be pushed through and detonated, killing or burying alive the occupants of the opposing tunnel. Often, as we heard in Edmund Blunden's poem, vicious hand-to-hand fighting would take place, and men would literally be trying to kick each other to death. It was a dangerous and messy business. If the other side didn't get you, there was always a danger of a roof collapse or suffocation from carbon monoxide. And the geology of the area didn't help either. Now, they'd often encounter a layer of quicksand, known in this area as the Kemmel Sands, which was a major problem for both sides. Now, working in the mine, you can see it was not for the faint-hearted. But the diggers would be the heroes of the day when it came to the Battle of the Messines Ridge. General Plummer had been put in charge of the attack on the Mezin Ridge, and in preparing for the battle, he ordered the laying of 22 mines underneath German lines all along the ridge. His plan being to detonate all 22 at 3:10 in the morning on the 7th of June 1917, to be followed by infantry attacks so as to secure the area. The work on laying the mines began 18 months before, and 8,000 metres of tunnel were constructed under the German defences. For over 2 weeks prior to 0 hour on the 7th of June, the Allies put up a huge artillery bombardment, and when it stopped, just 20 minutes before the mines were due to be detonated, the German troops rushed to their defensive positions, sensing an imminent attack, and waited. At 3:10, 600 tons of explosive blew up under the German lines. Mine explosions on the German defenders was devastating. Unintentionally, the mines went off at random, which added to the panic amongst the German troops. One would go off 2 miles to the left, and then 500 yards to the right, and then 2 about a mile away on the right. They didn't know where the next one was going to be. Some 10,000 men were killed during the explosion alone, which blew the crest off the Mezin Ridge. The night before the attack, General Plummer had said to his officers, "Gentlemen, we may not make history tomorrow, but we shall certainly change the geography." Well, it certainly did that. The explosions were audible in Dublin and by Lord George in his Downing Street study. And all objectives were reached by mid-afternoon, and the Mezin battle was a total success and greatly boosted morale amongst the Allies. Unfortunately, it left a deadly legacy, which is still relevant today. Out of the 22 mines laid, 1 mine had been discovered by German counterminers almost a year before and destroyed. And the 2 mines which remained undetonated on the 7th of June, well, the details of their precise location were mislaid by the British after the war to the discomfort of local townspeople. But one of them was detonated in a thunderstorm in 1955 due to the local electricity company unknowingly building a pylon right over the mine. The only casualty then was a dead cow. Now the second mine, and one of the most powerful, remains undetected, but it's believed to be roughly near La Petite Dove Farm, which, as it happens, is not that far away from where I'm standing now. So I'm going to tread rather carefully over this ground. Following the Battle of Messines, General Plummer suggested continuing the attack immediately towards Passchendaele, but Haig disagreed. His plan was that the next stage would start 6 weeks later at the end of July, and this would turn out to be one of the most controversial decisions made in the war. The 6-week delay meant that the Germans were able to strengthen their defensive positions, and the weather conditions were about to turn against the Allies. The main method for advance in the following attacks advocated that the artillery should put up a heavy bombardment that would last a few days, and then the troops would make an advance behind what was known as a creeping barrage. This is where the artillery range its guns on a particular line in front of the enemy, and then at 5 or 10 minute intervals the range would be extended, giving cover to the troops advancing behind it, and hopefully destroying the German defences along the way. Now this was a great idea given normal conditions, but with the rain that started to fall constantly on the battlefield, and the destruction of the watercourse by the artillery, the battlefield became a quagmire. In terms of an attack, this would mean that battalions weren't able to keep up with the barrage. Now anyone who's tried running across a muddy ploughed field will know what I mean, and a ploughed field in battlefield terms is relatively flat. The mud, which Flanders became renowned for, was a nightmare, and anyone slipping off the duckboards that spread out across the fields would be sucked into it and drowned. Horses and mules were particularly vulnerable to being lost in the mud. Shell holes would fill with water, mud, dead bodies, rats and the residue of gas attacks. But with a vicious defensive fire from the enemy, with machine guns mowing down troops in their thousands, shell holes were often the only cover available to troops out in the field. Men were forced to endure lying in a hole for days until they were able to creep back to their own lines. You're listening to Passchendaele, Triumph or Tragedy, on 107.3 Wayland Radio. Now, I've come out of Ypres, northbound on the N369, and just outside the city is the Essex Farm Cemetery, situated in the vicinity of the Essex Farm dressing station. There's a group of restored bunkers from the original site just behind me, which were built into the spoil of the nearby Ypres Canal. These bunkers give you an idea just how cramped the conditions were at the time for the medical personnel tending to the constant stream of wounded that were brought here. Now, it was here that Canadian medical officer Major John McRae was based. McRae later wrote of his time at Essex Farm. He said, "I wish I could embody on paper some of the varied sensations of that 17 days of Hades. At the end of the first day, if anyone had told us we had to spend 17 days there, we would have folded our hands and said it could not have been done." Now, one death particularly affected McRae. It was a young friend and former student, Lieutenant Alexis Helmer. He'd been killed by a shell burst on the 2nd of May 1915, and Lieutenant Helmer was buried later that day in the little cemetery outside McRae's dressing station, and McRae had performed the funeral ceremony in the absence of the chaplain. The next day, sitting on the back of an ambulance parked near the dressing station, McRae vented his anguish by composing a poem, and he spent 20 minutes of precious rest time scribbling 15 lines of verse in a notebook. Now, a young soldier watched him write it. Cyril Allison, a 22-year-old sergeant major, was delivering mail that day when he spotted McRae. The major looked up as Allison approached, then went on writing while the sergeant major stood there quietly. His face was very tired but calm as he wrote, Allison later recalled. He looked around from time to time, his eyes strained to Helmer's grave. When McRae finished 5 minutes later, he took his mail from Allison and, without saying a word, handed his pad to the young NCO. Allison was moved by what he read. The poem was an exact description of the scene in front of us both. It never occurred to me at that time that it would ever be published. It seemed to me just an exact description of the scene. In fact, it was very nearly not published. Dissatisfied with it, McRae tossed the poem away, but a fellow officer retrieved it and sent it to newspapers in England. The Spectator in London rejected it, but Punch published it on the 8th of December 1915. Now, following its publication, it became an instant success, and the poppy was taken by the British Legion as a symbol of remembrance of those who gave their lives in the First World War and subsequent conflicts. And that poem? In Flanders Fields.
In Flanders fields the poppies blow between the crosses row on row that mark our place. And in the sky the larks, still bravely singing, fly scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved. And now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields.
Now, John McRae died of pneumonia while on active duty in 1918, and visitors to the Essex Farm Cemetery make the easily made assumption that he's buried here, which is in fact what I did, when in fact he's buried at a cemetery in Boulogne. But one grave here stands out from all the rest, because it's just covered with poppies, and that's the grave of 15-year-old Private V.J. Strudwick. possibly the youngest Allied soldier to be killed in the conflict. Now we're going to head north about a mile or so now from Essex Farm onto Ypres. I'm at a junction on the N369 between Ypres and Zuiderschalt, and I'm standing next to a memorial which seems quite different to most monuments you come across in this area, and I think what makes it so different is this very tall stainless steel cross rising up in front of me. I think it's the, if you like, density of the steel that draws you in, and it glistens, but in a rather disturbing way. But that may have been deliberate, as this is the memorial to the first German gas attack of the First World War. It was at this point, on the 22nd of April 1915, during the Second Battle of Ypres, Germans used gas on the battlefield for the first time. To find out more about the use and effects of poison gas, I spoke to Alistair Watson, Professor of Medicine at the University of East Anglia.
Come in. Yes, right.
Alistair, were the Germans the only ones using gas in the First World War?
No, I'm afraid they weren't. All the participants in the First World War used poison gas. The first to use poison gas were in fact the French in August 1914, and they used tear gas. The Germans first used tear gas in October 1914, and then the Germans famously used chlorine gas in Ypres in April 1915, and then the British counterattacked with chlorine gas in September 1915. The British use of chlorine gas was disastrous. It was released from the front line of the British positions, but shortly after the gas was released, the wind completely changed direction back onto the British lines, and unfortunately there were 2,000 British casualties from that initial British release of chlorine gas.
So what were the various forms of gas used in the war?
Well, they fall into three families of gas. So the first form of gas that was used was tear gas, actually xylal bromide. And that was, the purpose of this gas was to blind your enemy so that they would be incapacitated and probably easier to shoot. That was used in 1914. It was then superseded by two forms of gas which are called asphyxiants. And the first was chlorine, which when it comes in contact with water, as is present in the the respiratory tract and the lungs changes into hydrochloric acid, and so the lungs are literally dissolved. That was effective, but had the disadvantage was it was very easy to smell and detect, and it was rapidly replaced by a gas called phosgene, which had similar effects, though it was twice as potent, and it was much harder to smell. Both these gases were replaced by mustard gas in late 1915 and early 1916, and this gas attacks all moist surfaces of the body. So not only does it attack the lungs, but it also attacks the eyes because of the tears covering the eyes, and any moist part of the skin, so for example the armpits or the groins. It causes blistering, which on the surface of it doesn't sound very serious, but the blistering is very severe. The blisters inevitably break down, and the resulting raw skin becomes infected, and in the absence of antibiotics, death was inevitable many weeks later, and so it was highly feared. The British squaddy, or Tommy, they used to be relatively sanguine about being shot because the chances are that they would die instantaneously, but mustard gas was feared because it was a slow, lingering and inevitable death that took many weeks or a couple of months.
What sort of protection did troops have at that time?
Initially, particularly with chlorine, having gauze swabs soaked initially in water was effective, because simply diluting the chlorine gas would dilute the acid that was made and would render it less injurious. Other liquids that were used on those swabs were urine, but the most effective was bicarbonate of soda, because it simply neutralized the gas. One of the reasons that mustard gas was so feared was because it attacked all moist surfaces. Gas masks were not effective, so although it would reduce, though not eliminate, gas going into the lungs, it didn't protect the eyes to any significant degree, and didn't protect other skin surfaces such as the armpits or the groin. And so it was very difficult, in fact impossible, to gain protection against it. One of the ways to protect oneself was to stand up. Most of these gases were heavier than air, and the individuals that were most severely affected were those that were poisoned while they were lying down, because they received very large doses of these gas. Those that were standing up next to victims lying down sometimes were completely unaffected. However, of course, the obvious problem with standing up is that you're more liable to be shot. But this issue of standing up and lying down was a pernicious one. So, for example, if you were in the open field and you were under machine gun fire and you jumped into a crater to avoid the machine gun fire, if there was mustard gas around, once you were in the crater, the mustard gas would get you and you would die a lingering death over many weeks, even though you wouldn't have been immediately shot.
If someone just got a small amount of gas, is it possible that they could survive that?
Yes, the majority of people survived gas attacks. So, for example, troops of the British Empire, there were 188,000 victims in the First World War, but only 8,000 of those actually died. So the death rate was roughly 4 or 5%. So the majority of individuals survived, although while being gassed and recovering for it, I should imagine was an extremely unpleasant experience. And many would have been left with permanent lung damage.
So what about treatment? Was there any effective treatment that could be given for gas victims or sufferers?
No, there wasn't, because the chlorine gas and phosgene, that destroyed the lungs, and in 1914 there was no way of supporting an individual with destroyed lungs. Today we would certainly have such patients on respirators in an intensive care unit in the hope that lungs would recover in time and heal. The reason many of these patients died wasn't just the fact that their lungs were literally destroyed, but also infection came in on the raw surfaces. And in 1914, of course, there were no antibiotics. Today, we would treat these victims very vigorously with antibiotics, and I'm sure we would save a proportion of them.
That's the sound of the 49 bells in the famous bell tower at Ypres. The tower is part of the Cloth Hall, which has been the centre of trade in the town since the 14th century, when it was the main market and warehouse for the prosperous cloth industry. In fact, the word diaper actually comes from the word d'Ypres, meaning from Ypres. And in the Middle Ages, it referred to a certain type of cloth with a pattern of small repeated shapes that was made in Ypres. The present meaning came much later. Throughout history, Ypres has been occupied by various nations at different times, and over the years it developed some pretty extensive fortifications, some of which survived the war and have been restored. You can do an official walk of about 2.5 kilometres around them today. By the 19th century, agriculture had grown in the area, and along with the cloth trade there was enormous prosperity in Ypres. Sadly, in 1914 all that was to change. In the 4 years of the war, the town was almost completely destroyed. Not one building was undamaged, and even the original Cloth Hall didn't survive the relentless German bombardment. After the war, Winston Churchill proposed that the ruins of Ypres should be left as a fitting monument to those who died, and that a new Ypres should be built close by. But by that time the local residents had already started pouring back into the town to rebuild their houses and businesses, and in the years that followed, the Cloth Hall was meticulously restored. In fact, when you look round the main square today with its beautiful architecture, it's hard to believe that this was all built after the war, as everything has been so effectively restored back to its former Renaissance glory. Just one bizarre note, legend has it that in pagan times a giant statue of a cat god stood where the Cloth Hall is now. When the locals converted to Christianity, the cat became a symbol of the devil, and it was all downhill for our poor felines after that. Records show that a cat festival was celebrated in the 15th century, closely related to Ash Wednesday Fair. But this event was no fun for cats. The highlight was the town jester hurling live black cats out of high towers to symbolise the exorcism of demons. Nowadays, the city holds a cats festival every 3 years, but thankfully the black cats that are thrown from the belfry during the festival are only stuffed toys. Well, I think it's time for a little rest and relaxation. During the Ypres campaigns there was only one place to go.
We've just driven 5 or 6 miles west out of Ypres to Popperinga, well known from the Middle Ages as a centre of cloth production. In fact, this is where we get the word poplin from, to describe material produced here, as the English traders at the time found it difficult to pronounce the letter R in Popperinga. At the outbreak of the war, Pop, as it became to be known, had a population of around 11,000 inhabitants, and that swelled to as much as 250,000 as the Allied war machine moved in. It was close enough to the front line to be accessible to troops, but not so near as to be a constant subject of shelling by the Germans. Now, its tiny cobbled streets here became jam-packed with vehicles of all sorts, bringing in supplies and troops, and also jammed with troops on their way out on leave. It became the centre of entertainment of all sorts, and shops were stocked with goods, especially food that wasn't available back home. There was a variety of entertainment on offer. There were cinemas, shows, as well as the theatre. In fact, there were joys of every sort available to the troops. Cafes and restaurants did a roaring trade, packed every night with officers and other ranks in places like Skindles, Hotel Cyril, not forgetting à la Poupée, or as it became to be known, Ginger's, named after one of the red-headed daughters of the proprietor who was said to have stolen young officers' hearts, but in a nice way. It was said that more champagne corks popped at Ginger's during the war than anywhere else in France or Belgium. But there was an alternative to the high life in Pop when it came to rest and relaxation, and I'm standing outside this beautiful white building just a couple of 100 yards up the narrow cobbled street from the main square. Now the sign hanging outside reads Talbot House, 1915 to ? Every Man's Club. Yeah, Padre Philip Bayard Clayton, or Toby Clayton as he was known, started up a rest house, an every man's club where men on their way back home on leave could get a meal and hot drinks for a minimal amount. Officers could also get a bed for the night. The house was stocked with a canteen, a grocery store, library, cinema, and up in the attic was a small chapel where services were regularly held. It was a house to cater to the men's spiritual and intellectual needs in various ways, and it had been jokingly said that it was the only house in Popperinga that was not a brothel. Now, it was named Talbot House after Gilbert Talbot, son of Bishop of Winchester, who was killed in the salient, and the local Tommies shortened the name using army signallers' language to TOC H. TOC H is still alive today as an international charity to help those less fortunate around the world. And it all started from here. There is a museum here at Talbot House, and it does have accommodation available, which looks much more inviting than our tent, I have to say. Of course, not everything about Popperinga was about fun and games. There was a dark side to the town as well. Now we come back across the main square to the town hall. Now this was used as divisional headquarters during the war. I'm just walking down the side of the town hall, and there's a gate into an alleyway there, and behind that's a courtyard. Now this is where the cells where condemned men, condemned to be shot at dawn, would spend their last nights. It's just a bare room with a brick floor and a rudimentary bed and a bucket in the corner. At the bottom of the wall people have laid poppies, and on the wall we're told that some of the original graffiti from the time. Now it's not that clear now, it's been nearly 100 years, and the quality of the bit I'm looking at is almost, well, it's childlike. But I wonder if that reflected the mental state of the guy who drew this. We've come back out into the courtyard now and into the sun. It was very dark in those cells, even on a day like today. And towards the top of the courtyard is the execution post. Now I'm led to believe this wasn't the original one, but this grim scene in front of me is emotive enough. The post is surrounded by wreaths and individual poppies, and on the wall is a plaque with words from Kipling's poem, The Coward. I could not look on death, which being known, men led me to him, blindfold and alone. I mean, okay, some of those executed were murderers and serial deserters, but some of those shot at dawn shouldn't have been here in the first place. With what we know about post-traumatic stress and shell shock, we know there was another way of dealing with sufferers, but they were different times. A rigid discipline was needed, and some judgments and punishments had to be harsh to keep the men together in this hell that they had to endure. I mean, what does cowardice mean anyway? You're listening to Passchendaele, Triumph or Tragedy on 107.3 Wayland Radio. I've now come up to Tyne Cot Cemetery on the ridge that overlooks Ypres. This is the largest British war cemetery in the world. It was named Tyne Cot after the German pillboxes that were scattered around on this ridge, and the Northumbrian Fusiliers who fought here said they resembled Tyneside cottages. Now, the cemetery was designed by Sir Herbert Baker, who also designed the South African memorial on the Somme, which we visited last year. Now, its design is reminiscent of a Greek style, which was the fashion in the 20s, and especially with the use of these elegant columns and pavilions behind me. And the Italian stone, which the cemetery is made of, shines a really bright white, even this late in the afternoon. There are just under 12,000 graves here, and 70% of them are unidentified. And along the wall at the back are the names of 35,000 who have no known grave. And this sad roll call is actually an extension of the names inscribed on the Menin Gate, where we're going next to finish our tour of this area. Now I get a remarkable view over the whole battlefield with Ypres in the distance. Now the front line was down below me about 8,000 yards away. Now, earlier on I mentioned that the Battle of Messines finished in mid-June in 1917, and it wasn't until the 31st of July, 6 weeks later, that the fight for Passchendaele began. Now, it was going to take 14 weeks for Passchendaele to fall early in November, at a cost of 300,000 casualties. Now what happened next was the cruelest act of all. Having taken Passchendaele, the British High Command realised that there was just not enough manpower or supplies to hold the village through the winter until a new spring offensive could be got underway. So what did they do? They withdrew. After holding Passchendaele for just 3 days, they moved back, in places to a line even closer to Ypres than the one they started from. They lost ground at a cost of 300,000 casualties. And that's what makes the Passchendaele offensive so tragic. It was a complete waste, a terrible sacrifice of so many good men, for nothing. We've now come back to Ypres for a very special ceremony, the sounding of the last post under the Menin Gate. And the Menin Gate was the gateway to hell. Through it passed thousands of troops on the way to the front, many never to return, and it was thought to be an apt place to put a memorial. This vast triumphal arch above me was unveiled in 1927. The architect was Sir Reginald Bloomfield, and he'd been appointed by the Imperial War Graves Commission in 1921. Now, facing out away from the town and towards the battlefields, on top of the arch is a proud British lion designed by Sir William Reed Dick. It was intended to be a symbol of the latent strength and heroism of the British race. Now, on the top, on the Ypres side, is a sarcophagus draped with a flag, and on top of it, a wreath, which was a symbol to the citizens of Ypres of the sacrifice the Empire had made for them. The Menin Gate is to Ypres as Thiepval is to the Somme, or Louverval to Cambrai. It's a memorial to the missing, those who have no known grave, and the names of 54,000 missing troops are inscribed on its walls, and each evening at 8 o'clock the last post is sounded in a simple but very moving ceremony. It was first played when the memorial was unveiled in 1927, and officials were so moved that an association was set up to promote the playing of the last post regularly to commemorate the soldiers of the British Empire who fell in the defence of the city and the Ypres salient, saving the independence and freedom of Belgium. It was also seen as an act of sympathy towards relatives of the fallen. Funds were raised from local business people and branches of the British Legion, and it was decided that the corps of drums and bugles of the local fire brigade should supply the buglers. So, from 1929, the playing of the last post here has become a daily event. It was suspended in May 1940 because of the German occupation, but on the 6th of September 1944, it was played as Polish troops liberated the city. Since then, the buglers have worn out a number of sets of bugles, but replacements have always been presented to them over the years. In 1959, 2 silver trumpets were given to the players, but try as they might, they couldn't get on with them, and they soon reverted back to their bugles. And so we come to the ceremony. After the last post is played, we hear the exhortation, which is taken from Lawrence Binion's poem, For the Fallen. Then comes the minute's silence, and then the laying of wreaths. And the buglers will finish off with the reveille. People from all over the world apply to come and lay wreaths at this ceremony. Tonight, the buglers are joined by an English youth wind band who have probably spent the day visiting some of the battlefield sites. And after that experience, I don't think they'll forget this evening in a hurry either. Now we've got 4 buglers tonight, resplendent in their blue fire service tunics and peaked caps, and they're just coming into position now. I look around and familiar faces stand out. The people who, like us, have spent the days visiting the sites, the graves, the battlefields and the memorials. We almost follow each other from one to another. And then, like flocks of birds coming back to roost, we all meet here again at the Menin Gate in the evening. Babies and young children squeak and giggle, not used to the silence and oblivious to what it all means. They'll find out in time. And close by, a guy from London we met in the bar last night. Like so many others, down to earth, loves his football. But he was drawn here. I got the feeling, searching for answers amongst the gravestones. Maybe answers to his own inner conflicts. Conflicts that we all endure in our daily lives from time to time. Bottled up until the cathartic effects of the battlefields allow us to let it all pour out. And there he stands, tears streaming down his face. Whatever he may be going through, he knows now. Nothing can compare with the horror that was Passchendaele.